Muted. There we go. All right, now I'm unmuted. Hey guys, welcome to another Motion University live stream. Sorry about the little technical difficulties there at the beginning. Such as the wonders of the internet. It's always fun. But we're super excited to have Paul Hastings with us today. But before we jump in, just a couple of notes. You guys, we can have you jump in the comments. And we'd love to have just some discussion. If you guys have any questions, things like that, definitely feel free to drop those there. We're going to be monitoring those, and I'll be kind of pitching those to Paul, and we'll be kind of discussing those as we go along. Also, if you aren't subscribed yet, I feel like such a YouTuber. If you do subscribe, you will get notifications when we go live and stuff like that. And we have a full streaming schedule this month. So one every Thursday at noon. So we have a lot of great guests, and we're super excited about that. But so jumping into this week's, I'm excited to be talking with Paul about the subject of podcasting. It's actually, so me and my wife are actually in the process of launching a podcast right now for a different one of our companies. And I think and I think if any of you have been paying attention over the course of, especially the quarantine and all that, there was a ton of people that got into podcasting. And so I'm just interested to hear from Paul, kind of his story and his journey of entrepreneurship. I've known Paul for quite a while now from the film circles, and he's been doing a lot like the fundraising side and all those kind of things. So I'm just excited to hear from him and how it can be used in business context, all that kind of thing. So with that, Paul, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Okay, I'm excited to be here too. Thanks for letting me join.
Absolutely. So maybe if you want to just give us a little bit of a rundown on kind of maybe some of your background, just for those who don't know you, kind of some of a little introduction to you. It doesn't have to be super long, but introduction to you, and then how you kind of fell into this whole podcasting thing.
Sure. Okay. So for a little context, just so everyone knows kind of the perspective I'm coming from, my podcast is called Compelled, and I interview people with unique stories of what God has done throughout their life. And we take those interviews and then we add sound effects and music, we add narration, professional editing, and we release it as an audio experience. So it's a very I would call it a very highly edited podcast. So that's kind of what we do. So now to back up there, I live in Texas, good old Austin. I've been here for, about 30 years, something like that now. And the way I got into podcasting was I had done 8 years in the political arena, in the Texas state political arena, had done lots of campaigns and legislative cycles, had been a lobbyist, things like that. But on the side, I also had this hobby as a filmmaker. And so got the chance to work on a lot of indie Christian films and produced some myself. And then had also, done some commercials and industrials. And so I had a kind of a production background. And then I would say it was either 2 or 3 years ago, probably 3 years ago, I was just off of a massive political cycle where I had been in charge of sending out pieces of mail. Like when you got to your mailbox, it's election time, you open your mailbox and there's like all these pieces of mail. You look at it for like 5 seconds and you throw it away, right? And well, that was what I was in charge of. I was in charge of making over, I think we did like 2 million pieces of mail. We spent $1 million for 30 different candidates. It was crazy. And I was the guy who was like running all the mail pieces, like leading kind of like the research and putting together the hit pieces and defense pieces and the budgets and the post office. It was just crazy, right? Working with designers and a print shop. I mean, it was insane. And so I was doing like, I don't know, 70 hours a week or whatever, and not seeing my family. My wife and I, we had a young daughter who was probably 6 months at the time. And I was just killing myself. And what I also realized was that like whenever one of my candidates would do really well, oh, I'd be excited and happy. And whenever a candidate would do very poorly or a negative attack piece of mail would come out in response to one of our things, oh man, I would be really upset. Like all these lies and like how can people say this stuff? And so, anyways, election day came and went. We won some, we lost some. But as we were just kind of like reflecting on like the chaos of everything and just trying to catch our breath, I began asking my wife, like, hey, I've been doing this political thing for 7 years now. Obviously, it's super important. It's very critical and vital about who our legislators and leaders are. But is this really, is this really our destiny? Is this our future? Is this what God really wants us to do for the rest of our life? And so we began thinking about, like, are there other things that maybe God would have us to do or would be pleased if we did other things instead that maybe would be more suitable to our particular season in life? And as we began talking about that, We talked about like, what are some of the skills and talents that we have? What are some of the assets and resources? And I'll talk about some of these steps that we went through to kind of arrive where we did. But as we did that, we began looking at my history and background in media production, just as a hobby, or sometimes for paid gigs, but mainly as a hobby. And then also realizing like, man, we have a lot of people that we've met in our personal lives that have these really crazy, amazing stories. Like one of them that just jumped in my mind right away was this friend of mine. She's about 70 years old, and she used to be an abortion clinic owner. She owned 3 different clinics, made thousands and thousands and thousands. She was very wealthy off of abortions. And then one day, she met this pastor who shared the gospel with her, and she thought the guy was crazy because she was already a Christian. She went to church every Sunday. She tithed faithfully 10% of every dollar she made from abortion. She tithed that to her church. She kept a Bible in the drawer at her office, and she would pray every day, saying, "God, don't let any of the ladies having abortions today get sick or die in my clinic." And crazy, right? And then one day this pastor shares the gospel with her. She thinks the guy's insane, and he begins just loving on her. And eventually she comes to find true faith in Jesus Christ, repents of it being an abortion clinic owner, and totally transformed her life. Today she's 70 years old now, and a very staunch pro-life advocate. But what a crazy cool story. Like, no one's ever heard of this lady, right? Like, what? Like, where did this come from? And she just lives here in Austin. And she was a friend of mine. And so, man, I was like, man, what if we could tell that story? And so that's what we began doing. And we had other friends like that. So that's kind of how we got into the podcast space. This is now our 3rd year of doing the podcast. We just launched season 3 on Tuesday.
That's right.
We do about 1 season every year is kind of our model. And that's how I got into the space.
That's awesome. So now, what kind of, like, I think one of the big questions I think in people's minds right now is we're talking about this thing of podcasting, and I want to also kind of dive into the entrepreneurship side of it in a bit later. But why is it seems like, I mean, how long podcasting isn't a new thing. It's been going on for quite a while, but why does it seem like there's been such a huge explosion of that right now with people doing podcasting and all that kind of thing?
Yeah. Okay, good question. Okay, so just a little context. We call it a podcast, right?
Yeah.
The reason we call it a podcast is because back in like 2005 or whatever, there were, or maybe it was like 2003, there was these dudes that were like taking audio files and like uploading them to the internet, and they would do it like on a regular basis. And then somewhere along the way, Apple realized that they could take these little bits of audio and they could grab them and put them onto the iPod. So this is before the iPhone even existed. Smartphones weren't a thing. And they put them on the iPod. So that's why they suddenly let's just call it a podcast. Yeah, that makes sense, right? So that's where the term comes from. So podcasting has been around, since 2005, something like that. So at least the last 10 years, before the iPhone was even a thing. But the reason that all of us are like talking about it now is because it's definitely grown in popularity. So
Gotcha.
I knew the exact stats like a couple years ago. I don't know the numbers right now, but it's something like, half the American population listens to a podcast at least once a week. It's becoming the new form of radio. And so, it's convenient. Anyone who's listening to this conversation, I'm sure they're totally aware of it, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
What was your original question?
Well, yeah, no, that's great. Honestly, I guess maybe a clarification on that is like, there's so many people doing podcasting right now. It's kind of like YouTube in some ways, where it's like, did I miss is it like there's so many people starting new podcasts? Should I even consider it right now? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Good question. Okay. Yeah. So I totally know what you mean. So actually the podcasting space has had this massive land rush even during 2020. So during the pandemic, I actually just saw a stat about this last week, and it's something like half of all podcasts launched ever happened in 2020.
Whoa.
So like all the 2019, 2018, 2016, all those years, and then like suddenly 2020 hits, everyone's at home in their garage or whatever, staying away from other people, and they're bored. Oh, we'll start a podcast,
Yeah.
So just out the roof. Now, just because everyone has a podcast, everyone and their dog has a podcast, doesn't mean that everyone's listening to you might have a podcast and maybe 5 people listen to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way that I approach it, 'cause even in 2018, when we were launching our show, there was a lot of podcasts out there. And we were asking ourselves, like, we could do a podcast. Like, should we do that? Like, is anyone going to listen or care about it? And the reason we did is because we cared about it. Like, we
Yeah.
actually cared about the stories, and we didn't know how many people were going to listen. Maybe nobody would listen. But we told ourselves, like, hey, even if we could just do this for like a season, a single season,
Mm-hmm.
and if we do it and we're like, yeah, whatever, we'll be happy that we did it, because like our underlying motivation was it was about a topic that we actually cared about, and it was with friends that we personally knew. And so that was the kind of our more primary motivation. So our motivation wasn't so much business oriented, although that was definitely something we thought about. But it's also just something like, we wanted to pursue it kind of as an experiment to see if it could lead other places.
Yeah.
Now, what I would encourage someone else that right now, if you're thinking about launching a podcast, yeah, totally. There's a ton of podcasts out there, but they're not all created equal. And so there's definitely a space for well-made podcasts. I think that space hasn't really been explored. So even though everyone's talking about like, oh, there's all these podcasts out there, and it's true, a lot of them are very poorly made, or they're all kind of the same, right? Like
Right.
I could point out probably 100 different podcasts. Like off the top of my head, I could probably spit out to you 100 might be an exaggeration, but 50 podcasts right now that are all hosted by a certain type of demographic of person.
Yep.
And all cover the exact same topics, and they even go through the same set of guests, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing unique about those shows, and accordingly, I don't think they have significant audience growth either.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So, what would you say? So, okay, let's getting back to a little bit of the story. What was one of the biggest challenges that you faced in starting a podcast? Like, obviously, we all have big ideas sometimes, but actually making them happen can be a challenge. So, maybe walk us through that journey of like what it was like. Okay, well, you have an idea, you want to tell these stories. Now what?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I wanted to make this show. I wanted to make a podcast, and so my wife and I, we were, when we were talking about doing the podcast, one of the things we had talked about first actually was like maybe making videos, because again, my background was in video production, and so we were thinking like maybe we could make a whole bunch of videos that kind of be like those the I am second videos, like testimonial videos, whatever. And at the time, I was like, no, like, I still have a political job. I still have a job, and the video production, I know a lot about video production. It's timely. It's time consuming. It's expensive. Let's just do a podcast instead, right? Because I've been listening to shows and stuff like, oh, podcast, easy, 5 hours a week, max, totally max, only 5 hours a week. We'll do this as like a little side hustle on this, while we're still doing my main political job. And so thankfully, I had the wise idea though of realizing like, hey, I'm not a video editor, I'm not a podcast editor, I'm just not an editor, right? Like I'm a producer, I'm great at producing stuff, but I should probably find someone else to edit these shows for me. And so I was like, man, I'll just find someone else who, they're at a season in life where they can help me out. And, and so I called up some friends of mine and eventually spoke to Zach Fowler. You know, Zach. So called up Zach. It's like, hey man, I think, I'm launching this podcast. Could you edit it for me? I think it's going to be, 2 or 3 hours a week, nothing big, right? I'm just going to record a conversation. I'm such a good conversationalist that it's just going to flow and the storyline's just going to go. It's just going to be super easy. All you got to just like remove some ums and uhs, no big deal. And so Zach said, sure, I'll totally do that. I was like, great, And so we launch our season. And so I'm really glad that I worked with Zach, because like he and I both, without realizing, we had very high standards of excellence. So like, even though we said, oh, it'll just be super, like what we ended up was like, oh, no, we can't let that go out. It's got to be better than that, guys, And so we started editing away. And, again, I told my wife I was going to spend like 5 hours a week. Zach had been told he was going to spend like 2 or 3 hours a week. And in the end, we were actually I was spending closer to 25 hours a week on the show.
Whoa.
Zach was spending probably 10 to 15 hours a week editing it. And these are just conversations, right? Like,
right.
But like, it was because I think it was and that really kind of set the footing for like what our shows become today, because I think we realized like, man, no, we really want to craft these stories together.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how our process went.
Yeah. I feel like I can relate to that because I know we've actually been in the process of recording a new, episodes for our podcast coming up, and it's sort of the same thing where it's like, okay, it's just a conversation, but then once you actually get in the editing room, you have like an hour long thing, and ultimately you probably want to have it be more like 45 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that, more digestible, and then you're like, man, like you don't realize how much you kind of go in different directions and kind of all over the place when you're actually having a conversation, or there's just different stuff that ultimately is interesting when you're talking to somebody face to face, but maybe isn't as interesting to people listening. You kind of have to get into it a little bit quicker. So,
or like when you cut something out, right? Because let's say you have I was doing like a 2 hour long interview, 2 hours was the raw interview we would capture. And the goal was to edit it down to like 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes. So what would happen is like I would have this 2 hour conversation, and then we'd be like, okay, we're going to slice it down. But we realized that if you start editing, we wanted it to sound like a natural conversation. But if you cut out certain things that just don't make sense for the 30-minute story, well, now you're missing context.
Yeah.
When they say something, it's like really good. Or like, oh, they said this really great phrase or this Bible verse or whatever that, oh man, that's really good. And you want to put that in there, but you don't want all the other stuff. And so like suddenly you lose context. And so then I realized, like, here I am, like back in my room, pretending to ask a question all over again. But I'm just like staring at the wall, trying to get my voice to modulate to be exactly the same as when I was in the space with the guest. And I'd be asking a totally brand new question, but like throwing context into the question. And like, but all of that to just try to make the show sound like it wasn't edited in the first place.
Interesting.
And so that's one of the so like if you listen to like Focus on the Family or Dr. James Dobson, their shows are made just for radio, right?
Yeah.
And so their links are always the same, like exactly 25, 30 or whatever it is, right? And they always are exactly the same. But they have like a whole staff or production team of people who like, that conversation they originally had is like nowhere near that short, right? And so they have a whole staff of people who are like crazy editing. I don't know if Dr. James Dobson sits back down at the mic and pretends to ask questions again, but still, like, there's all this process that goes behind the scenes. And so, even though it doesn't sound like it was edited, there's just tons of work and labor that can go into that.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Really quick, if anybody's just joining us, I'm talking with Paul Hastings, and he's the host of the Compelled podcast. And I've been really enjoying listening to the last two seasons, and they just dropped season 3 on Tuesday, which I got to hear a sneak preview of the first one a couple weeks ago, and it's definitely a really interesting story worth hearing. But so we're talking about podcasting, and so far we kind of talked about different things, some of background on how he got started with his podcast, some different things to keep in mind, and one of the questions that we talked about was with so many, I think, Paul, you said half of all podcasts were launched just last year. So is this the right time to be starting a podcast if you're interested in it, that kind of thing? And I think just to kind of summarize some of that conversation, really it comes down to the why behind it. So if you're doing it just to try to market yourself or just for the sake of making a podcast, it's not to say you shouldn't necessarily do it, but that you're not going to have the same results as if you're doing it from like a true passion of, for Paul, it was you're telling these stories, like these are stories you want to tell, so you want to have them recorded somehow at least. Even if nobody listens, you're still going to do it. And so I feel like that makes a difference, like the why behind it. And for us with our podcast, not to give too much away because we haven't actually officially launched it yet, but we're actually sitting down with law enforcement officers all across the country and just having real conversations. So it's something that we wanted to do because we do recruiting films all the time. So we have interviews with people, but when you put it into a 2-minute video, you have to cut out all of the stories and things like that. So having a 45-minute or something length thing for us was like, okay, this is just a really cool way to be able to capture that and kind of support this community. So having the reason behind it, ultimately, if the reason is you want to do this regardless of the audience, sometimes then that's how you actually be more successful. Because then at the end of the day, you're judging success by what you're doing rather than by the numbers. And I think that could be pretty helpful. So diving back into that, then what would you say if somebody's interested, say they have something that they are excited about talking about or launching a podcast, what are some practical steps for people? And we also talked about how much of a time commitment. It seems so simple, but it actually can be a ton of work. Maybe walk people through a little bit of like what's some practical steps they could take and we'll get into maybe more the actual tools and stuff, but maybe still a little bit big picture, kind of building blocks of what people should be thinking about if they're interested in starting a podcast.
Sure. Well, yeah, good question. Off the top of my head, here's a handful of things I'd really suggest, and I should mention this also. I have a talk that I gave at a podcasting conference about a year ago, where I talked about a lot of these things. And it was a year ago when I gave the talk, and so my brain at the time was like really into the space, and I knew what I was talking about. Right now, it's a little fuzzy because I've been concentrating just on my show.
Yeah.
But the talk's recorded, and we can send a link to you, Andrew, in case anyone wants to get a hold of that talk. And great, yeah. But so some things that I would recommend for anyone thinking of starting a podcast. One is you need to think through what your niche is. So if you're just going to have conversations with your friends or whatever, well, that's great. And no one's going to listen except your friends. And that's okay. Like if that's what you want to do, you could totally do that, right? But if you're trying to make something that you're hoping will either turn into like a longer term endeavor or something that's going to be financially feasible or whatever, think about the niche that you're going to pursue and really be honest with yourself. Like, I would recommend, put together a little, pitch about what you think the show is going to be about, maybe like just a couple sentences, and then ask some friends of yours, like, hey, I'm thinking about making a podcast about this topic. Be honest with me, right? I'm going to spend half a year of my life working on this. If you think this is a bad idea, but you're like too afraid to tell me, then I just need to be honest with myself. Because if you really care for me, convince me not to do this, right? And just look for some really honest feedback. So I would do that first. The second thing is understand that no matter, and yeah, put down on a piece of paper like how much time you think it's really going to take you, and then multiply by 2. So if you think it's going to take you 5 hours a week, it's probably going to take you 10. If you think it's going to take you 20 hours a week, it's going to take you 40. And that's just the honest truth. That's how it's going to work out, right? And maybe as time goes on, then you'll get to more palatable numbers. But that's how it's going to happen. And the third thing is I would encourage you not to do it alone. So one of the things that I've advised people who are entrepreneurially driven is you're not the expert in everything, and you can't be, right? You're like, sure, you might be really talented, and that's awesome, but you need to work with people that are better than you in everything. So the same reason that I have an editor on my show, sure, I could edit, but I'm not well versed at it. And so we hired an editor to work on our show. And he's crazy good. He's way faster than I am. He makes way better judgment calls than I do. And so work with experts. So don't go it alone. Either find a partner. And the last thing is, like, if you're saying to yourself, like, oh, no, I can't afford that. Like, I can't afford to hire an editor. I can't afford to work with someone who does graphics or whatever. Like, I'll just do it all myself. Well, remember, time is money, right? So if you're going to do it all yourself, that is a lot of time. And because you're not an expert at it, it's going to take you even more time than it would take an expert. So you're like really signing up to spend a lot of money on your own part because time is money. But the second thing is you can pay these people, but you don't have to pay them with money. And so that's what we did with our show. When we first started out, yeah, of course, we didn't have extra funds laying around to like go and start this podcast, right? Like we had a little bit of money. We used it to buy equipment, but not all forms of compensation are monetary. Let that just sink in for a second, right? Not all forms of compensation are monetary. So I cannot tell you the number of times throughout my career path that, there's been something that I've been trying to achieve. I wanted to work with someone really good, but I didn't have money to spend on it. And, it's one thing to, not have much money. It's another thing just to ask someone like, hey, will you work for me for free? Like that's,
right.
that sounds really awkward, right? But that conversation is way more respectful if you're able to say like, hey, we don't have much money. We can pay you a little bit, but I also have these other forms of non-monetary compensation. I have an email list. I have a podcast listener base that you can, you can run an ad on our podcast right now, or anytime in the future. Even if we have, are crazy huge in the future someday, you'll get free ads for 3 ad spots or whatever, anytime you so choose, or free, push out to our email about any topic you so choose. And even though we're small now, if we're big in the future, you will ride with our success. So that's one possibility you could do. Another thing is like, hey, I provide, in my regular day job, like I provide consulting services for XYZ. And so suddenly now that's something that you could provide as maybe, again, non-monetary compensation. Like, hey, I'll give you 20 hours of coaching, or whatever. And there's just creative ways that you can talk with people about things. So I would really encourage all of you guys to think about who are experts or people that's super talented that you could work with to help you in your endeavor, and ways that you could compensate them fairly. And it doesn't have to be money alone.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's some really great thoughts, especially picking a target audience and a niche, and then like talking to people in that niche and seeing if what your idea is actually is interesting to them. I think it's as a tendency, especially as entrepreneurs or something, is to be like, oh, I have this amazing idea, I'm gonna go make it, and then it's like, and then crickets, like, oh, nobody actually cares. So actually making sure, I think there's a book, I haven't actually read it, but I've heard good things about it, called The Lean Startup. And there you
go. This book right here, guys.
Yes.
This book. Eric Ries. Go ahead.
Yes. So anyhow, just the concept being kind of like, just build what you know people want, and then don't build more until you know that they want it, that kind of thing. So kind of the same concept of making sure you're doing your research. Is this something people are actually interested in? Or maybe if it's just literally just you chopping it up with your friends, then maybe that's just the extent of it, and that's totally fine. Maybe it's just like a new form of home videos, right? But so that's really cool. So once you kind of have your idea and you kind of go from there, how do you go about, building an audience? I feel like is such a challenging aspect, and it's going to be different for different people. But what has been some things that you've found have been helpful to kind of build that reach? Especially, I don't know if you had an email list to start with or how that worked, but how do you kind of like get it off the ground?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a really tough answer to give you. So let me just kind of like put everyone's context together. And I can only speak from my own personal experience and the handful of friends that I've spoken with, right? So I can't make like these overarching, like, oh, this is how to do it, guys. But I could say what I did. Maybe it'd be helpful for you.
Yeah.
So again, my background was in video, right? So I've worked with a lot of videos, done industrials. And so I was used to seeing stats that are video stats, right? So like you release a video on YouTube or on Facebook video, and that if you made a decent video, it's decently okay. Maybe you spend a lot of time working on it. You might get like 20,000 views, and that's a good number, right? At least for me, right? That was a good number. If I got 20,000 views on something, great. Sometimes you might work on an industrial and like, no advertising money's behind it. It gets like 1,000 views, and you're like, oh, kind of disappointed, right? So when we launched my podcast, I don't know what to expect, right? Because like all I knew was video stats, right? Like that's what I was used to. And so we launched our show thinking like, hey, if we get a few thousand listens, great, totally different experience, completely different experience. We got like maybe a couple hundred downloads the first week, and I was basically disappointed. I was like, oh, this, what? Only a couple hundred downloads? What? Like, we worked crazy hard on this episode. This is a crazy story. Like, what? And so, but as we continue turning out podcast episodes, that's kind of where we stayed at. We were like getting a couple hundred downloads a week, maybe 300 a week, and that's kind of where we were at that first season. And we had some spikes and stuff like that, and we had some really top quality guests. Like we had an NFL Super Bowl champion who came and shared about how he came to the Lord, and he shared the episode with his friends and everything. And again, we only got a few hundred downloads that week. We got on the front page of the Gospel Coalition, which is like a massive website, probably in the top 1,000 most visited websites in America, right? On the front page of the Gospel Coalition. And we got massive amounts of web traffic that day, massive amounts. But the actual podcast downloads it was just a few hundred. And so there were some things that, like, as I've had time to kind of think and dwell on this, I've talked with other people about this phenomenon. It's that the barrier of entry, like, convincing someone to watch a video on YouTube or Facebook, it's a 3-minute commitment. That's a much easier standard than asking someone like, hey, I want you to commit 45 minutes to listen to this, right? Not only that, if you're on Facebook, you're scrolling through, and if you're scrolling past a video and you hover over it for at least 3 seconds while you're talking to somebody else, boom, it's a video view, right? It counts as a view, right? Whereas podcast listening, the average podcast, so yeah, let me go backwards. The average view of a Facebook video, like the actual view length, once it counts as a view, I don't know what it is, but I've seen stats on my own videos I've done before, and it's a crazy steep drop off, right? Like by the time you're like 50% done through any video, even like a 3-minute Facebook video, like you've got maybe like half of the audience, you're doing good, even to have half of the audience, right? But with a podcast, the average podcast listener who starts listening to a podcast is going to listen to at least 75% of the entire show. Doesn't matter the length. If they started a 2-hour podcast, they're going to listen to the average podcast listener is going to listen to 75% of that 2-hour podcast episode. Now, those are averages, right? So like, don't go and think like, oh, I'm going to make a 10-hour long podcast. No, you'll probably be like the guy that makes all the numbers go down. So, but those are some rough numbers there. And I don't know the exact stats, but those are the rough figures there. Wow, I was on a roll here.
So yeah, we were just talking about the how to grow an audience. So I think you were talking about like the difference.
Yeah. So growing out, So there's a massive difference in the stats. So first off, you got to be realistic and understand what kind of numbers you should be expecting, right? So we had the good fortune of our show. We were then, So the Gospel Coalition, right? We got on the front page of the Gospel Coalition, but the average Gospel Coalition reader is a reader. They're not a listener, right? So if you're on the front page of a website that's built for reading, everyone who goes to your website, they're ready to read something. And so they're clicking a link, they're expecting to read. And so if they land on a page and it's just got a little episode summary and then an audio file to listen to, like maybe a couple of them will, but most of them, no, they were there to read because like they're in a quiet context, they're in a quiet room, maybe their family's sleeping, maybe they're like reading on the job, I don't know, right? But they're not in a position to be listening to podcasts, right? So if you want to get podcast listeners for your show, the best place to find podcast listeners is not on social media. It's not on articles. It's not on news websites. The best place to find podcast listeners is on other podcasts.
Interesting.
So let that sink in. So with season 2, and again, now we're in our 3rd season, right? But so like in season 2, we cultivated that relationship with the Gospel Coalition and with other websites. And so we were on the front pages of many websites, actually. And we began writing very lengthy article summaries, like crazy. Like, in fact, we just wrote an article summary yesterday that was almost 2,000 words long, which is a lot of words, okay? That's like a good 10-minute read, right? But we began writing these very lengthy article summaries so that when we had a ton of visitors came from the Gospel Coalition or from some other website, when they landed on our website, they weren't prepared to listen to audio, but they could still read. And so they would read the entire article. And we could tell this from looking at our Google Analytics stats. Like as soon as we made those big, long summaries, people would stay on our website a long time. And we got anecdotal feedback from people saying like, hey, I didn't have time to listen to the episode, but I read it. It was so good, blah, blah, and I shared it with my friends. That's great, right? That's a win for you. They shared it with their friends. And some of those friends are going to listen to the podcast. Some of them are going to read the full-length article summary. And when I'm saying an article summary, I'm not saying like a transcript, right? People don't like, I don't like to read transcripts because transcripts are boring, right?
Yeah.
But I like to read summaries because summaries are like, they're engaging. It's crafted by a storyteller, right? And so that's one of the things that we did to cultivate that audience. And so, but then the other thing is now for this 3rd podcast season, and now we've adapted our strategy. And so we are partnering with other podcasts out there. So these other podcasts will approach them as like, hey, you've got a big audience. We've got a big audience. Because I should clarify, our audience exploded in growth during season 2. And now we're in season 3 and we're excited to see what's going to happen. So I've got a big audience. You've got a big audience. Let's do an audience swap, right? I'll run a podcast ad for you. You run a podcast ad for me. It doesn't cost either of us money, but we both cross-expose each other to our audiences. So that's what we're trying right now this season. We're waiting for the first ads drops to hit the market. So it hasn't happened yet, right? Like we're waiting for that to happen.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens there.
That's such a fascinating concept. So I'm imagining with those people that you're interfacing with, like you said, like Gospel Coalition or other podcasts, you're specifically looking for other people in a sort of same vein, like the audiences would be similar, correct?
The same niche. Yeah. So same vein. So it doesn't have to be the same niche. So like in our show, we're not looking for other Christian storytelling podcasts to cross-promote. We could do that, but we're looking for other Christian podcasts that meet a certain kind of theological barometer. So our show is made for believers. We're not an evangelistic show. We're more of a show for existing believers. So we're looking for other shows now to work with. So for instance, we just got a ad swap done with the Christian Publishing Show. And so they are a show that's geared towards aspiring Christian authors and writers. So our audience, I don't know how many of them are Christian authors or aspiring writers, but a decent number of them probably are, right? Like, there's some stat out there. I think it's like, actually, I don't remember. I think it's like 2% of the American population has written a book, which is a lot if you think about it, right?
That is, wow.
And I would imagine among our listeners, it's probably a little higher ratio actually in our group. And so, so we gave a promotion for the Christian Publishing Show, and then the Christian Publishing Show, they're going to give a promotion back to us. Now, I would imagine with the Christian Publishing Show, I think a much larger number of theirs would be interested in listening to our show, because I think those people are always listening for good stories as they are, working on their crafting of storytelling. And maybe they're looking for something to write a book about. I don't know. So at least that's what I imagine. So we just ran an ad for the Christian Publishing Show like 2 days ago on our show, and we're waiting for their ad to hit their audience and promote us next.
Nice. That's awesome. Okay, so another question that I know a lot of people are going to be wondering at this point. You mentioned you had different guests and things like that. What's your process for going about getting guests for shows? Like, if you don't necessarily have a direct connection, right, at least initially, like, what's your process for moving forward with that?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so we had an unfair advantage, and that's why we did it, right? And so if you're an entrepreneur, always look for your unfair advantage. So we had this unfair advantage that we had just met a ton of people, and that I've been rather studious about keeping track of people that I meet, right? Like, I have a spreadsheet of people that I meet. I input everything into Google Contacts. I keep notes about like their dogs and their children's names and stuff like this. And so I just have like this rolling database that I've kept for like the last, since I was like 18, and I'm 31 now. So I have an unfair advantage, right? I just know a lot of people, and my wife knows a lot of people, and she was from a totally different friend circle than me. Like, she lived in a totally different state than I did. So we actually had two massive groups of people that we just met over the years. And so we were able to use that for our first season. Everyone that we brought on the show, most of the people that we brought on the show were personal friends or friends of friends. Now, as time has gone on, if we're looking for a new podcast guest, so here's an example. So we're going to drop an episode with the Benham brothers next week, actually. Benham brothers, Jason and David Benham. And so literally, I sent them a cold email. I went to their website. I figured out what kind of their email, like their company's email format was. And then I just took a stab at what I thought their email addresses would be. I emailed them a cold email saying like, hey, we've had these other really great guests on our show before. Can I interview you when I come to North Carolina later this month? And one of them wrote back and said, sure, whatever, come to our Bible study and then interview us afterwards. And so I was like, great. So I showed up, went to Bible study with them, and then interviewed them afterwards. It was great. Another example, and this is something that all of you guys could do, I think, is like utilizing your previous guests you've had on the show to help you get other guests. So sometimes you can ask a previous guest, like, hey, who's someone else I should bring on my show, right? And that could be helpful. But also, if you have someone that has a lot of credibility, you should make sure you include that in your pitch email that you're going to send out. So for instance, when we landed the NFL Super Bowl champion, Bruce Colley, crazy story, episode number 6, if you want to listen to that. He won the Super Bowl twice, actually. Crazy story. But we got to interview Bruce because a friend of mine had listened to the show, liked it, and I happened to know that this friend of mine knew the football guy. And so I asked my friend, I was like, hey, you've heard our stuff. It's very well done. We've already had this crazy episode with this lady who used to be an abortion clinic owner, and that's a crazy story. We had this other story with a lady who works with death row inmates, and she's like 80 years old herself, so she's about to die, but she's working with people who are waiting to die and sharing the gospel. It's crazy, right? And I was like, hey, can you introduce us to Bruce? And so my friend said yes. So we got to interview Bruce. But then now that we had the interview with Bruce, then we approached Ryan Dobson, the son of James Dobson, later on. I was like, hey, Ryan, I've never met you before, but hey, here's all these people I've interviewed before. And the crazy thing is, like, no one, only once have I ever been asked by a potential guest how many listeners we have on our show.
Interesting.
Which is a crazy thought, right? Now, maybe that's going to become a more relevant question that's going to happen now that there's this massive influx of these shows that, but that's been our experience so far. Only once have I ever been asked how big our show is. Because when I lead with like, hey, we've interviewed this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, I mean, we seem huge, right? So yeah, that's a little power tip for those that are listening.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Really quick, Doug Weiss jumped in the comments here. So hey, Doug, good to see you.
Hey, Doug.
And he says, hi, Paul and Andrew. Paul, do you script your intro and interview questions, or do you have what you want to talk about in mind and just talk conversationally?
Good question. So when we first started out the show, I wanted it to go just totally conversational and just like roll with the flow, because I didn't want to prep. I didn't want to spend the time preparing, right? Like, I just wanted to read an article about the person, have a few ideas in my brain, and just roll the flow. My wife really encouraged me, and she's like, Paul, I know you're a great conversationalist, but you're not good enough. you need to spend the time preparing on it. And so I begrudgingly began doing that after a couple conversations where I realized, like, man, I'm just not good enough at this thing alone, right? So now what I will typically do is if I have a guest, in fact, I have a guest I'm working on right now. But yeah, here's a good example. So this was a book written by a lady that she's a midwife today. She delivers children, but her first child she gave up for adoption. This is back in the 1960s, before abortion was even. She never even heard of abortion, and so she gave up her child for adoption. And incredibly traumatic. She was 16 years old, not married, anything like that. And then 50 years later, her son found her, and she'd been trying to find her son, but her son found her. It's a crazy story. Very powerful. She got to share the gospel with him, and then he died 9 months later after being separated for like 50 years. Just insane story, but beautiful, powerful story. And so I knew a few details about her, but not enough. And so I got the interview scheduled with her. I was in Kansas at the time, and I was going to have like 3 days before the interview happened. So I went to the local library, found a copy of this book that thankfully they had, and I just power read the whole thing. Actually, I think I did this all in like 36 hours, actually. So I power read the entire thing, took copious notes, collected my thoughts together into like in a little document. And then when I go to the interview, then I read off I refer to my notes to just kind of think about what I'm going to ask next, just to make sure that I'm hitting all the points. And then because I have an editor, we're able to then like mesh it together really well. In our second season, we began using narration. So remember, I talked about like it's insane trying to like splice and cut things to make it sound like you didn't edit. So our second season, we're like, you know what? Let's just let everyone know that we edit, and we'll just embrace that fact. And so now we use narration, and man, you can like fast forward through time. It's like such a powerful tool if we really like it that way. And that's why NPR podcasts, they do that all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like the second season of your show felt a lot more like an NPR type production, where it's like it's kind of giving context and kind of, I feel like giving it a lot of structure, kind of walking through it. And that's something that we found too. Hannah and I were just talking about this as we were editing our podcast. It was like, man, like it's so hard to, because it's easy to have the pacing is hard to maintain, because there's stuff that's interesting and there's stuff that's, it's their story, which is awesome, but it's just kind of just normal life, and it's not quite as interesting, and it's more difficult when you have that conversational feel to do that. So I think I'm sure it's kind of like genres of movies. There's probably different styles of podcasts too. So I suppose it just depends on what people want to do, but
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Okay. So, man, this hour is flying by really fast. But there's a couple more questions I want to talk to you about really quick, kind of more technical on the podcast end of things. But one would be, how did you decide how often you wanted to put out a podcast?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so when we first started our show, the thought was that it was kind of an experiment. Like, we didn't want to commit to like, oh, we're going to create a podcast for the rest of forever.
Right.
And this is even before that I knew it was going to be so many hours. Like, this is back when I thought it was only going to be 5 hours a week. All right. But wisely, I'm so glad we did this. Because actually I had heard from a friend of mine, and they run a podcast for like a dental association. And they said it's this beast.
Yep.
Every week you've got to find a new guest, and you're scrambling to get the guest onto the show, finally record it, and then a couple days later, oh, we need another guest next week. Right. And it's this never ending cycle. Now it's, so we didn't want to necessarily do that. So we wanted the ability to just make a bunch of episodes and then just step back and not disappoint our listeners either, let them know that it was a season. And so that's why we chose the seasonal model. There's a lot of other big podcasts out there, like The Pitch is one of the ones I'm thinking about right now. They do a seasonal model also. So we chose to do the seasonal model at the very beginning. We just arbitrarily said 15 episodes, because that just sounded like 15 episodes, right? So that's what we did for season 1, season 2. This season 3, we're going to do 12 episodes. Pretty close to 15, but just the mathematics work better. But in the middle of season 12, we'll also insert a behind the scenes episode. So it'll be like this special episode, which is basically our raw recording from our interview with an incredible guest. That just like the entire interview was so good, but it's going to basically be like 2 hours of a podcast interview, but no editing or very minimal editing, no narration. It's just going to be the raw interview. So we'll throw that in as like a behind the scenes special that we normally offer to our podcast members. who normally pay like $10 a month to get access to all that stuff, but we're going to offer that particular episode to everybody. But what that's going to do for us is that's going to buy us an extra week of breathing time so we can kind of catch up with the editing pacing schedule and just give ourselves a little week vacations rest there.
Gotcha. So you guys are releasing every week. Is there a benefit to doing that every week when a season is going, or like, because I know it seems like at some level it's like if you do it monthly or something, then people start to forget. Like, is there a certain logic behind the every week thing?
Yeah. No, it was just kind of an arbitrary figure that we decided on. I've never read research that indicated one way or the other. What I have heard, and I would say this is anecdotally true, whatever you do, you need to be consistent. So if you go once a month or every 2 weeks or once a week, whatever you do, just make sure you do that and do it consistently and let your audience know ahead of time, this is what we do. You know, because what you don't want to do is like, hey, we do it every week, and suddenly you're gone for like a month and you never told your audience what was going on. And it's like, oh, people are like, what, like, so yeah.
That makes sense.
That's what I would advise. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Another question is especially pertinent now with so much of the social distancing and all these kind of things. Not to mention, it's always been these people all the way across the country and stuff. Yeah. Have you ever done interviews not in person? And if you have, is there any guidelines or things that can help? Because it's just not the same as when you're in person. Technology and all these kind of things. Any notes on that?
Okay. Yeah. So context. So our show. We have really very high standards of excellence for Compelled. At least we try to. So one of the things that we realized is that a typical podcast interview is going to be recorded remotely because it's the day and age that we live in. And this is before Zoom, before the COVID thing happened, right?
Right.
So most podcast interviews are recorded remotely. And even right now, we're on this YouTube phone call or whatever, and like it sounds tinny, right? Because we're literally transmitting our voices into outer space and then back down again. And they're like bandwidth limiting stuff, blah, blah, blah. And so the quality is just not as good. And so with our show, I actually fly or drive to wherever the guest is located. And that's a really high commitment. But so normally I try to tie it into like we're doing a family vacation. And so I'll look at my spreadsheet like, hey, who else lives in this area of the country? And then I'll reach out to a whole bunch and we'll record some interviews, or doing a business trip, same thing there. But we record all of our interviews in person. We did do one interview that was remote, and that was with John Fornoff. He had professional recording equipment. He was literally in the studio recording a Jonathan Park episode.
Sure.
And like literally turned off the mics and then turned on his mic, and then we did an interview. But that's the only one we've done remotely. Everything else has been in person. We don't own the fanciest, best mics. Like the mics I have are like $80 mics, but I got them for $40 each on eBay. But because I'm there in person, it doesn't matter that my mic is not the best. I'm literally there in person, and so our audio quality is superior to everyone else's. I'm spending face-to-face eye time with the actual guest. Like I literally sit with the guest, and so it's like I build a relationship with this person for 2 hours. And later on, if I see this person at a conference or an event later on, we know each other because we spent 2 hours hanging out with each other. Yeah. Here's another crazy thing. Yeah. So yeah. That would say now if you're going to record remotely, because I understand that not everyone can do that. I totally get that. But let me say that would definitely make your show stand apart from anyone else's in your same space for sure. But if you are going to record remotely, there's a couple of great tools out there. One's called Zencastr, Zencastr.com, Zencastr.com. And then a competitor of theirs is called Squadcast.fm. I don't know. One's Zencastr, one's Squadcast. I don't know if it's .fm or .com. But those are two recording tools where you can record from your computers at the same time, but they're actually recording local files to the local computer, so the quality is a lot better. And then they both upload at the same time and then synchronize in the cloud later on, like hours later on. They synchronize later, so your quality is a lot better.
Yeah.
You still lose that face-to-face interpersonal connection. You can't, it's just different.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. That's awesome. That's, I think, super helpful, especially for those who can't. But again, we've recorded all of our podcasts in person, but pretty soon we're gonna have to it's just not practical all the time. Especially we've decided to do the every other week model and just kind of ongoing. So we're trying to record a bunch all at once with one department, and then we can release them and stuff like that. But so we won't be able to do that. So this is a little bit selfish of me, like coming on and having you on, because it's like, oh, I have all these questions for you.
Yeah.
But because I'm just legit interested. But let's maybe dive in really quick before we let people go today. Maybe dive into some of the business side of like, how can this be helpful? Why should people maybe consider this from a business perspective? We have the reasons that we decided to start it for our business, partly because obviously we wanted to tell these stories regardless. It's a passion project for us, but there is some business reasons why this can be helpful. So maybe if you want to just talk a little bit about that, if maybe that's kind of the extra nudge, like sometimes it's hard to just commit time straight up just on a passion project. What's maybe some of the benefits from a business standpoint that people could get from having a podcast?
Yeah. Okay. So a handful of things. Three things jumped in my mind right away, and these are tied to some of the reasons that we cared about creating our show. One is like it was literally the reason, like it was something that we were truly passionate about. So if you're a business and you're thinking of making a podcast, look for an angle that can feed your passion. Or if you're on some lowly employee at some random company and you've been told like, oh, we make widgets, but everyone's got a podcast now and we need podcasts too. Go make a podcast for us, bro, right? Well, then you as the employee, look for the angle that is unique or interesting that you could actually feel passionate about. I have a friend who works for an electrical company. They literally transmit electricity to customers, and that's all they do. And they decided to make a podcast, and he makes it interesting. I listened to a couple episodes. I don't even live in that part of the country, and it's really fun to listen to. Like he's entertaining. They have really interesting questions. Like, how is it the squirrels can run on the electric wires and not die? But then if I do, I might die. Like what? Like I've wondered about that myself. It's so it's really interesting, and you can feel his passion for the topic because it's I don't know, he's just like feeding his own curiosity. So he took what could have been a very boring, dry show and has turned it into something that's really fun. Okay, the second thing is a benefit for us, at least, is making relationships and meeting people. So like under no other context could I call up a Super Bowl champion or a 9/11 survivor or a woman that used to be a hostage in the Philippines for a year with Muslim terrorists. No other context could I call these people up and be like, hey, I'm coming through town. Can we get coffee for a couple hours? I just want to meet you.
Right.
Right? Like, that's not going to happen, right? That's weird. Like, if someone called me and said, hey, I'm coming through town, I want to spend a couple hours, I might do that. But, like, that, I'm not, like, a famous person, right? But I can contact those people and be like, hey, I have a podcast. And we've interviewed all these famous people. Can I spend some time with you and interview you, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, they say yes, right? And actually, I am literally enjoying the moment of learning from this person, sitting at their feet, asking any question that pops in my brain. Anything that I feel like asking, I can ask, and they might tell me. And like I didn't pay for this consulting time. I didn't pay for this opportunity. I'm literally this person one-on-one. I'm not like some, huge audio conference center. It's just me and this person. And now this person literally knows my name face to face. Maybe I have the cell phone with this person. I can like text them later on, like some kind of cool thing or whatever. They might text me. I don't know. It's a very powerful relationship building thing. And all it cost me was time and effort of making a show that was really cool about stuff I cared about anyways. Wow, that's crazy, man. Crazy.
That's awesome.
The third and final thing, and I would encourage you, if you're thinking of making a podcast, one thing that was good for us is also establishing yourself as a credibility factor, right? Giving yourself a credibility. Because like no one's ever heard of Paul Hastings, but like, oh, Paul Hastings, he's the guy that had so-and-so on their show or that person on their show or whatever. You should talk to them about XYZ. Oh, you should be on the Motion University podcast. Well, great. I'll be on it. So whatever.
No, that totally makes sense. And I think there's another concept of like what you call, and I think you were kind of alluding to this, but the borrowed authority. So, you maybe don't know anything, or well, maybe you're not known in a certain industry for something, but you're talking to all the top people in that industry. And so by name association, they assume that you must be kind of at their level. And it's not, you're not putting on a false front. Like you're literally learning from and facilitating these conversations. And so it just associates your name with their authority of those people. You're not saying I'm that authority, but you're bringing people the authority from other people, and then it establishes, oh, you're a thought leader. I should go to you because you're able to bring these people together and create these experiences. So that's just another aspect. I think they call it borrowed authority, or there's another word for it too, I think. But yeah, authority
Yeah.
marketing is another aspect to the content marketing, authority marketing from a marketing-ish standpoint for a company. Those are all things that can be done too. So anyways, if you guys have any other questions, I would be happy to answer those real quick. But as we close it out, maybe Paul, two things. First of all, a story from a listener that maybe was impacted from your podcast. I don't know if you have a crazy story to share, and then maybe we'll do our lightning round at the end of some practical resources. So first, what's a crazy story from a listener, or something that was a story of how your podcast impacted someone?
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, this is really cool. So I mentioned earlier, our show is made for believers. It's not an evangelistic tool. But just a couple of weeks ago, a former coworker of mine texted me, and she's not a believer. She's not a Christian. And she texted me and she said that she had listened to a particular episode. We have this episode with a lady who she was taken hostage in the jungles of the Philippines. She was a missionary held hostage for a year by Muslims. And the day that she was released was the same day that her husband was killed by friendly fire in the jungles at the same time. But this missionary later went on to forgive all of her captors. She has actually paid for the college education of several of the captors' children. And she's reached out to them where they're now serving life in prison. Very powerful story. And so this particular listener, again, a secular coworker, not a Christian, contacted me and said that she had listened to the episode, and I didn't know that she was going to listen to it. She listened to the episode, and her comment was something about like it was such a powerful example of mercy and grace. And it was just cool. Like as I shared that with my wife, we were just reflecting like, wow, that's intriguing. Like, and she said it was one of the best podcast episodes she's ever listened to.
Wow.
And
that's awesome.
yeah, it was really cool. And again, this is from a non-Christian saying that, and so it just made us think like, wow, maybe God is using this to plant seeds in her life. So that was really cool.
That's awesome. That's so cool. Yeah. Okay, so what we like to do when we wrap up our kind of the conversations is kind of what we call a lightning round, which is basically just give folks some quick, you don't have to expand super much, but some quick references on some resources and that maybe they would find helpful on podcasting or entrepreneurship. I know we didn't get a chance to dive into all the entrepreneurship stuff like I wanted to. I know you're actually going full time with the podcast this season. Let's see where we are on time. Maybe, okay, really quick. Maybe just talk just really quick about how, like, what's all going on with that, and then we'll get into that bit.
Okay, so basically, for any entrepreneurs out there, so my wife and I, we did this podcast as an experiment at first for the first season. Our second season, we also had, we spent a lot of time on that. This is our third season, and so we've made an intentional decision to last year. I worked my tail off working for just regular contracts and stuff, and we saved aggressively, very aggressively. We saved a ton of money on the side. And so this spring, for the next 4 months, I'm working exclusively on our podcast. I've closed all of my paying contracts, so I'm literally working just on the podcast, on marketing, promotion, building relationships, getting exposure, doing calls like this one right here. And the reason we're able to do that is because we set ourselves up for success a lot earlier. So we live debt-free. We live in a mobile home, which we paid in cash, but we live in a mobile home on a very junky part of Lago Vista, Texas. And so we have incredibly low expenses, low monthly expenses. We are rigid about our budgeting. So like we keep a spreadsheet of every dollar that we spend. And we have a budget that we gotta certify that with every month, and so we know every dollar that's going in and out. We're watching everything very closely, and we're doing that so that way we can take these entrepreneurial ventures, these experiments, take these jumps and leaps of faith that sometimes just take a lot of time. And this is something that we found to be successful for us. This is our second time doing this, so we're excited to see what happens.
That's awesome. I'm super excited for you guys. It's amazing when you can take that time to just focus on something to where you don't actually, like, you just have 100% focus. You're not, trying to jump between things. So I'm excited to see where the podcast goes this season. But okay, so our lightning round, some practical resources for people looking to get into starting a podcast.
Listen to the Gimlet Media podcast called Podcast Academy. I think it's called Gimlet Academy. It's on Spotify. It's a Spotify exclusive. Gimlet Academy. Listen to that.
Awesome. Fantastic. Any book recommendations on that kind of this whole entrepreneurship journey and all of that?
Yes, 3 book recommendations. So I would recommend The Ride of a Lifetime by Bob Iger. Great story. He's the CEO at Disney.
Mm-hmm.
Alchemy. This is going to change the way you think about stuff. Alchemy, okay? Just read it. Crazy, crazy read, but it's going to make you think about life a lot differently, especially if you want to be an entrepreneur. Lynchpin by Seth Godin. Again, it's going to change the way you think about things. Super digestible, very easy to read, kind of like blog articles, but really great read.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks again, Paul. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing. I feel like we could have honestly talked for 2 hours. There's so many things we could go over.
Yeah, totally.
But how can people get a hold of you, and how can people learn more about the Compelled podcast?
Yeah, so you can learn more about me by going to our podcast website, compelledpodcast.com. And there you can learn more about me, learn more about the show, listen to some more episodes. We just released our first episode of the season. So yeah. Oh, and if you go there, I actually have if you go to the About page at the very bottom, there's a link to links for aspiring podcasters. And so I have a list of all the equipment that we use, all the software that we use, our workflow, tips about podcasting. And I developed all that for like a podcast conference I was speaking at a year ago. So I'll send that link to you also, Andrew, in case you want to send that out to anybody else who contacts you.
Awesome. And I think, I know we dropped the link to the compelledpodcast.com in the comments. So if you guys want to find it there, you can do that. But awesome. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks again for taking the time, sitting down with us. Hopefully you guys found this valuable as well. So yeah, before we let you go, just heads up, we have more great content coming up. Basically every single week we'll be doing a stream on Thursday. So next week we have Seth Rice is actually joining us, and we're going to be talking about spec projects, and kind of like one of the biggest questions we get is, how do I get work? And one of those things, when you're not getting work, you have more time usually, which means you can have the time to do spec projects and kind of be able to gain a new audience that way. So we're excited to have him next week. So if you aren't already, you can go ahead and hit that subscribe button, which sounds super YouTuber-ish. I'm still weird saying it, but and you can hit that bell because it will give you better notifications that way. But with that, guys, thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again next week. So we will talk soon. Bye.